So, Andrea, can I invite you to
Good morning, Christina. Good morning, everyone. And thanks for having me again here at the Sustainability Week. It's a real pleasure. And first of all, it's great to be back in presence after years. You know, yes, we are streaming live on the Prysmian Group website and social media, and also Milano Finanza website this morning. But it's here, the engagement, you know, and first of all, you mentioned the 12 booths, so countries and regions that reply to the call for ideas. It won't be just talk, it will be innovation you can touch, hands-on. Walking the talk. And tomorrow will be spectacular with all the ideas and all the countries presenting the innovation that comes from inside the company. And this morning, we're going to take a trip in what is sustainability and innovation for Prysmian. Just have a quick look because we're going to start with the vision of Prysmian sustainability and business with the CEO Massimo Battaini, and then we're going to talk about sustainability supporting Prysmian Group business, finance and strategic value of the integrated reporting with you and your guest, making an impact, human resources, sustainability by design, technology and innovation. It will be all about interaction. So just to give you some information, you've got a very simple channel you can use. It's already open to interact with the people here on the stage, which is a simple telephone number. You can take a picture of the screen, which is +39 335 63 50911 335 63 50911 for your question that I will ask the panelists. That will start with an incredible keynote speech, Christina, because you know that sustainability is not about just about business, it's also about policies. And
setting the scene, right?
Setting the scenes. And different governments, especially in the US and in the EU, are taking different roads approaching this, which are absolutely relevant for all of the stakeholders that are here. So we asked Professor Carraro, which is Vice Chair of the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, you know, the UN body that produced the most authoritative report on the climate change, to be here. He's from Venice, where he's the Emeritus President and Professor of Environmental Economics at Ca' Foscari. So please welcome Professor Carlo Carraro.
Good morning. Good morning, and thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation, Christina. Thank you, and above all, for the excellent organization of this event. I went through the boats outside, and it's amazing what Prysmian is doing and will do in the coming years. I'm going to talk about policies, as announced a few minutes ago. I'm going to talk about a comparison between the US and the EU approach on climate policy, starting by the recognition that climate policy is becoming more and more industrial policy. It's transforming itself into an industrial policy, sometimes into a trade policy, and sometimes into restrictions to trade. And we should be able to redesign or take care of the possible counter effects that these policies may have, both on climate change, both on the fight against climate change and on economics. But let's start by introducing the US Inflation Reduction Act. I'm going to compare the Inflation Reduction Act with the EU Net Zero Industry Act. The Inflation Reduction Act is mostly a subsidy program, tax credit, mostly tax credit that subsidize clean energy, renewables in particular. They subsidize clean manufacturing, clean vehicles, in particular electric vehicles. The amount of money over 10 years is quite big. It's about 400 USD billions, 40 billions per year. But the important feature of this program is that the amount of money is uncapped. That is, the 400 billion, 392 billions is indicative. But in reality, it is uncapped, and the amount of resources that will be devoted depends on demand, and it's likely to be much larger than this amount of money. For the rest, the feature of the program are the usual one. You get these tax credits. The tax credits can be paid directly You don't need to wait for the credits to emerge in future years. You can even transfer the credits. You may, for the Italians, this may sound familiar. You may transfer the credits to other people. And the program is designed to favor regions of the United States that are less developed, poorer counties, or companies and sectors where there are difficulties, in particular infrastructures or plants are going to be dismissed and replaced by the new ones. So there is a social dimension in the program which is similar to the one that we see also in Europe. The objective, most importantly, the objective of the US Inflation Reduction Act is to reduce emissions, and then you see here how the emission reduction would increase from about 24 to 35% under the current policy, and will become 31-44 under the Inflation Reduction Act. The goal is to reach the US Paris Agreement target, which is even more ambitious, about 50%. But the Inflation Reduction Act is certainly the instrument that is leading the US to get very close to the Paris target. How? By increasingly supporting one of these growth. This is the one on clean power capacity, the growth in clean power capacity in the last years. You see the growth is outstanding, with the exception of 22. We will talk about it in a minute. And this growth will be further supported and expanded by the Inflation Reduction Act, with some interesting feature. 81% of the capacity is installed in low-income counties, as I mentioned before. This was one of the objectives of the Inflation Reduction Act. But more surprisingly, 80% is installed in Republican-held congressional districts, so Republicans that are often deniers of climate change. The states recently approved laws against banks and insurance companies to use ESG criteria in their own decisions about loans or about insurance contracts, but at the same time they use this money, because of course business is business, and they use the money to create infrastructure, in particular CO2 pipelines, CCS, but also renewables infrastructure to produce clean energy in Texas, as you can see, and in many other Republican-held states. So it's good news anyway, because it's supporting the transition. The bad news is that the Inflation Reduction Act contains subsidies to green technology with something which should not be there: local content requirements. They should not be there because they're against WTO rules. And US has been the country supporting WTO rules more than anyone else, historically more than anyone else. But in this case, they produced a law with a provision which is clearly against WTO rules. Local content requirements implies that these new power plants, renewable-based power plants or electric vehicles or whatever, must be produced either in United States or must contain enough components manufactured in United States. And of course, this is going to exclude some foreign producers and from these kind of subsidies, or favor relocation of producers in the United States in order to get the benefits of the subsidies. This is clearly inconsistent with WTO rules. This may induce trade retaliations. China, of course, already did it. And there is, of course, a positive effect anyway, because these subsidies reduces the price of these technologies, and by reducing the price of the technology, they help spreading technology all over the world. This is similar to what subsidies, 15 years ago, subsidy in Germany and Italy to photovoltaics helped reducing the cost of solar panels in Europe. I mean, the big effect was an effect that was useful for all European countries and not just for the two that subsidized the photovoltaics initially. So there will be a benefit from the US policy, but at the same time it will be a cost, and the cost is trade restriction because of what I just said. And indeed, we see that the negative impact is there. For the first time over the last 5 years, clean energy installations fell in the United States. Rather than increasing because of the subsidies, they fell because of the trade restrictions, because of the difficulty of getting the inputs that the US needs in order to build the power plants or the electric vehicles or whatever, the clean technology. Same is true for electric vehicles, in particular for the supply chain that crucially depends on China. Products and materials, and if these products and materials are not supplied by China, of course, the process is slowed down. And high-speed trains is another case of a delay in the US policy, because the frictions with partners implied that they couldn't build as much trains and infrastructures as the administration, the Biden administration, had in mind. So there is a counter effect induced by this local content requirement of the US policy. It is true that even in Europe, the EU Fit for 55 package contained some trade restriction. In particular, the carbon border and adjust mechanism. I mean, you probably know what it is. It's this mechanism that ask foreign producers to pay a tax, a border tax, if they want to sell in Europe a product which is produced in a country or through manufacturing procedures that are not consistent with either the policies in Europe or the amount of emissions which are emission restrictions which are introduced in Europe. A polluting country, a country that produces too much emissions, cannot sell into Europe unless they pay this border tax. And of course, this is a trade restriction. But it's not based on a local content requirement. It is based on emissions. And this is allowed. It is consistent with WTO rules. So it's a restriction, but with a very different base. Another example is the regulation on deforestation-free supply chains. Even in this case, the control on the supply chains of products imported in Europe is a trade restrictions, but again with environmental reasons. But anyway, if you look at the situation, you see that environmental protections has sometimes negative trade implications. And there is not just the US and Europe, there is Japan with a very similar transformation plan with money devoted to the green transition. There is India with a production-linked incentive scheme, which has a similar effect on solar photovoltaics and batteries and other technologies for the transition. And UK and Canada and many others. I mean, all over the world, we have this emphasis on supporting the transition to zero emissions by focusing on technology, on innovation, new technology, the deployment of existing technology of zero carbon and existing technologies, and of course, networks and infrastructure. And it is clear this is a huge opportunity for Prysmian. Now, what's the EU Green Deal Industrial Plan and the EU Net Zero Industry Act? Is it a reaction to the US Inflation Reduction Act? Is it something that we Europeans are using to counteract the negative implications of the EU decisions? Let me just explain what it is. 4 pillars in this EU Green Deal Industrial Plan. First of all, fast-track permitting. And the focus is on regulation, on simplification of regulation. You want to get simple rules and simple processes for authorizing these investments in battery factories or solar power plants or similar zero-carbon technologies. So permitting is the first focus. The second one is funding. I'll come back on this, and the idea is to make funding easier and to help state, and this is an important revision of state aid regulation, to help states supporting domestic companies in the green transition. Human capital. A crucial component of the transition is human capital. We already lack the experts, the skills to support the transition, to employ workers with the right skills for the transition. And there is a big focus on what they call net zero industry academies in order to prepare workers or to reskill workers for the transition. And finally, open trade. Open trade is the last pillar, and this is an indirect answer to Inflation Reduction Act. The EU wants to answer, apparently want to answer with open trade in order to make the supply of raw materials or critical raw materials easier than in the past. So this is the Green Deal Industrial Plan, and the Net Zero Industry Act is a component of this more general plan. This more general plan is indeed composed by the Net Zero Industry Act, by the Critical Raw Material Act, by reform of the electricity market, and by a reform of public procurement in European countries. So there are 4 reforms. For the moment, we only get the first one. The second one is almost ready. The third and the fourth one are meeting some difficulties. But let's start from the Net Zero Industry Act, which is the objective of today's discussion. And it focuses on technology, on deployment on technology, of existing technology. It's not really on innovation. It's not really on discovery of new solutions to reduce emissions. It's focusing on deployment of well-known, commercially available technology to accelerate the transition. And what are these technologies, strategic net zero technology? This is the list. I mean, they're well known. I mean, you all know these technologies, you see. Solar photovoltaic, electrolyzer, wind, biomethane and biogas, batteries and storage, CCS, heat pumps, in particular for domestic buildings, and grid technology. Grid is also very important in the transition. And the focus is on these technologies, and all measures in the Net Zero Industry Act are designed to support and favor the deployment of these technologies. And of course, we need it. I mean, this is what the International Energy Agency says about the necessity of a rapid diffusion of green technology. And in the case, for example, of solar and wind power plants, we need to multiply by 4 the capacity by 2030. As far as electric cars are concerned, we need to multiply by 18 the number of electric cars in Europe if we want to be consistent with the trajectories leading to zero emissions in 2050. This is, of course, what the International Agency sets as a benchmark, but we want to get close to this benchmark. We need to support investments into these technologies. And the benefit, the number in this case is coming from McKinsey, the benefit is huge, because we are now producing more or less 36 gigatons of CO2 emissions per year, and we, by favoring the diffusion of the technology, by the deployment of heat pumps and solar and wind power plants and so on and so forth, we can reduce the 36 gigatons of carbon by 6.5 gigatons, which is a huge amount, a huge fraction of the total amount of emissions that we need to abate, that we need to get rid of. So diffusion of clean technology is important, and both in the Inflation Reduction Act and the European Net Zero Industry Act are targeting this important objective, the diffusion of technologies. And how? What are the actions? As I said, the focus, even in the Net Zero Industry Act, is on fast permitting. Again, the focus is on the acceleration of permitting. But not only this, I mean, there are what they are called net zero strategy projects. There are projects to attract new investments into these technologies, the Zero Industry Academies to get the skills, and so on and so forth. I mean, the usual actions are the one that you can figure out, but the focus is really on fast permitting. With, in the back of the mind, however, some concern about trade, again. And there are two words that you often read in the European documents. You can often hear from European leaders. The first one is strategic autonomy, and you have been hearing this word for the last couple of years, and more recently this anti-coercion instrument, and it is an instrument, a legal instrument that the European Commission has established to fight against possible trade restrictions imposed by other countries on European industries. But most importantly, restrictions imposed by foreign governments, and China is it's never named, of course, in the documents, but China is the country which is in the back of the mind of these leaders, because the dependence of European industry on China is huge. In the same way, it is very important even in the United States. But this anti-coercion instrument is the way in which the European Union would like to reduce dependency and protect themselves, protect the Union from an excess dependency from Chinese productions, in particular in the field of photovoltaic and electric cars and zero technology, the ones that we mentioned before. So to get more autonomy from imports and increase productions in Europe. Funding is a crucial dimension of this story. And what's not surprising is, whereas in the United States we had those 400 billion uncapped, in Europe there is no additional funding. The Net Zero Industry Act has no additional funding, just 1 billion for what was called the Net Zero Europe platform. Now, 1 week ago, it was renamed Strategic Technology for Europe Platform, STEP, but STEP has 1 billion funding. All the rest, all the funding for the Net Zero Industry Act must come from other sources, from other existing EU programs. So what the European Commission says, okay, you can use the Repower EU, you can use the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the Invest in EU, the Cohesion Program, the Innovation Fund. They are all funded, they have been funded in the past, but there is no additional funding for the Net Zero Industry Act. Maybe this is the right approach, because there was already a lot of money, and many countries, for example, did not submit yet plans to use the Repower EU, including Italy, did not submit a plan to use the funds from Repower EU. The Recovery and Resilience Facility has been used, but only partly. On the loans component of the Resilience Facility, the Recovery Facility, is not used yet. I mean, 3 countries have been using this component for the moment. There is a lot of money in the InvestEU, because InvestEU is similar to the Juncker plan. It's a plan in which there is a co-funding from the European Union, and the rest of the money must come from states or from companies. But the main idea behind the Net Zero Industry Act is that national governments, individual members of the European Union should fund, and the rules will become easier for state aid funding. I mean, behind this, there is this idea that state aid funding for companies, for industrial plans, industrial policy will become easier. Finally, the European Sovereignty Fund. This one was proposed for the midterm. It has recently been dismissed. So I think there is no chance to see this fund in the coming years, at least not before the next EU election, and probably even later. So this is a situation about funding, and this is a situation that contributes even further to these dynamics. The dynamics of investments, as you can see, is extraordinary. In 2022, more than 1 trillion were invested in green technologies worldwide, and this number is increasing quickly, and these two programs, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Net Zero Initiative, are further increasing the money that will be devoted to these solutions. Time is over. Let me conclude quickly. Does the EU Green Deal counteract, is a way of counteracting the restrictions of the Inflation Reduction Act? The answer is no. It doesn't do it. There is this anti-coercion instrument, but generally doesn't do it. It is for open trade. Should it do it? I think that it should not do it. I mean, this is the right approach. We should try to boost EU structural competitiveness. We should to focus on our own capacity to do better than the others and faster than the others and develop better technologies, rather than starting a conflict, a conflict with the US administrations on the Inflation Reduction Act, even though there is a table, there is a committee which is studying how the EU can be exempted from some of the restrictions imposed by the United States. And my conclusion is therefore that what's behind these measures is very positive. They are supporting the development of the technologies. There are some critical points yet to be addressed, in particular networks, not only electricity networks, which is a big concern both in the US and in the United States. In particular, as you can see, we need a huge expansion of the network in the coming years, but also other networks for hydrogen and CO2. A lot of CO2 pipelines are planned, for example, in the United States, and none of them in Europe. So there is a lot to do, in particular, on networks, but cooperation, openness, and cooperation even with China are crucial for the next 10 years if we want to achieve the climate targets that all countries, the EU and US in particular, have established. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Professor Carlo Carraro. Now, just a couple of questions before we let you go. First is coming from the audience, and you mentioned the Critical Raw Materials Act, and the question is it more about enhancing domestic production and availability of those raw materials, or about open trade for those, because you mentioned both?
Yeah, it's more
your mic?
For the moment, it's more the second. So over the midterm, there will be an effort to increase the production, the domestic production of the raw materials. But this is difficult, in particular, in regions like Europe, where there is not such materials. So it's most on creating a diversification of suppliers and more openness in trade. And this is really the focus of the whole document, insisting on the importance of open trade.
All right. Now, Professor, my question in a very nutshell, I know it's tough, but you described the playbook and the guidelines of US and Europe for the future of sustainability. But 2024, there will be a general election in Europe, there will be an election in the US. Do you think that these guidelines will be there also in 2025, or some major changes could happen?
The political decisions depend on political vision, on willingness to pay attention to future generation and the future goals for our societies and only for our planet. So if we are going to elect leaders that don't have this kind of vision, of course there is a danger that some of this, not all this, but some of this will be lost. However, I showed the numbers on what's happening in Texas and other Republican states because the consciousness that this is the way in which our own economic future is going to be shaped is very clear in the United States. And I think it will become clear even in Europe. So if not for environmental reason, they will do it for economic reasons.
For business reasons. Thanks again, Professor Carlo Carraro. Grazie.